Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. I'm very excited today to welcome Jon Gertner, the author of a new book, The Idea Factory, Bell Labs and the Great Age of American Innovation. And for all of you who are interested in innovation and how this company innovated so much, it was the birthplace of the transistor, the C programming language, the first cellular phone systems, the Unix operating system, the integrated circuit, communication satellites, the laser, the first fiber optic cable systems. This is something that you should pay attention to. There's a reason why Bell Labs was able to innovate the way that they did. Jon Gertner, the author of this book, is an editor at Fast Company magazine, and he's a writer for the New York Times magazine. The scientist behind Bell Labs' phenomenal success is portrayed in a very exciting way in this book. I really am excited to talk to Jon about Bell Labs, and I thank you, Jon, for all the work that you've done to make us more aware of how profound and big innovation really is and how we have an incredible model to look at. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Jon Gertner to It's Rainmaking Time. Good morning.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Well, I think the first thing that I'd like to talk to you about with respect to this book is how long did it take you to write?
I'd been thinking about it probably going back about 10 years. I actually began the writing of the book in the spring of 2007.
It's a big book, but there's so many interesting facets of it. Now, I know you focused a lot on the team that was very causal in a lot of the innovation, but you also shared in the book about the fact that even though it seemed like it was a monopolistic giant, it was considered to be a living organism culturally. They had a nobody can be turned away policy if you had a question or needed help. Could you talk a little about that?
Sure. It was a complicated place where there were, as you say, it was a monopoly, and it was somewhat contradictory in the sense that we don't necessarily think of monopolies as positive in a positive way anymore, and for good reason. I think they limit consumers' choices. They can slow the rate of innovation. They can make things very expensive. But being attached to the phone company, the phone monopoly, as Bell Labs was, as the research and development arm of the phone company, allowed it to kind of create these string of innovations that were in many ways very, very good for the country. Now, how did it do those? Well, it had a lot of resources. It was again, being attached to a monopoly allowed it to have large sums of money to spend on people and on materials and on resources. It could also think really long-term towards not just the next quarterly report or annual report, but to plan for the future of communications 5 or 10 or even 20 years in advance. And that allowed it a certain kind of freedom, at least for some members of Bell Labs who worked in the research department, to really think long-term. But there was a kind of way of managing this group. And again, not everybody was in one big mass of people. There were not only departments of different disciplines, but there was a research department which was really about 10 to 15% of the people who worked at Bell Labs. And these were PhDs mostly, scientists and mathematicians, physicists, chemists, metallurgists, and the like. And they were pursuing new knowledge, or they were thinking, as I said, far ahead to the future of communications. But a lot of people at Bell Labs worked in the development side of things, where they thought about the phone system. And this was an era where they didn't really use the word network so much as they used system. And these were largely engineers and technicians who were thinking about real-day, everyday problems in the phone system, how to plan ahead or implement new technologies to make what they thought was, and I think they were right, the best communication system in the world. And it was a very effective combination in the sense that there was, by being attached to a real company with a lot of problems, technical problems that they were solving every day, the researchers could really think practically at the same time as they would think idealistically. And it was, as I said, a fertile combination that led to this series of breakthroughs that I don't really know if there's any parallel to that in modern history. And, this was, as I say in the book, was really a factory of ideas. It really just kept churning out things in response to its obligation as part of the phone monopoly.
I wanted to cut right away to Mervyn Kelly because it is understood that Mervyn Kelly hired brilliant physicists and engineers like William Shockley and Walter Brattain and Jim Fisk and Charles Towns, who basically were thought of as setting the agenda for future famous discoveries. Do you agree with that?
I think with Mervyn Kelly, if it's okay if I talk a little bit about him.
Please.
He came from a poor family in rural Missouri, which I think was in many ways indicative of a lot of these people who came to Bell Labs, even up until the war. They weren't really from elite families. They were really, as I say in the book, from intersections of nowhere and nowhere, small towns. A lot of them were really good with farm machinery, where they could take cars apart and put them back together. And Kelly worked in his father's hardware store. Nobody in his town went to college, but he won a scholarship to the University of Missouri at Rolla. And then from there, he discovered physics and went to the University of Chicago and eventually made his way over to Western Electric, which is the manufacturing company of the phone monopoly, and made his way to Bell Labs in 1925 and rose up through the ranks to become the head of research and eventually the president. And he was a formidable presence. He was an incredibly energetic person, brusque in many ways. People were a little bit scared of him. But he was also somewhat of a contradiction, that as much of a rush as he would be in, he had a deep appreciation for allowing his researchers to have time and freedom, to some extent, to pursue deeper knowledge. He had a best friend at Bell Labs who influenced him deeply in his early days, a guy named Clinton Davison, who also won a Nobel Prize, actually. But Davison was somebody at Bell Labs who, in the beginning of Labs' history, was somebody who wasn't really interested in solving practical problems. He was really searching for new knowledge. And it made a deep impression on Kelly, because Kelly would watch as people at Bell Labs, colleagues of his, who had a problem no one else could answer, would go to his friend Davison, and Davison was the only one who could answer it. And what that did was, not only could Davison answer their problems, but by imparting knowledge, not just a kind of solution, you should fix your device by doing X or Y or Z, but by explaining to them what was going on in the nature of the materials they were using, or how they could conceptually think about what they were building, allowed the workers and his colleagues at Bell Labs to make improvements on devices that were just orders of magnitude better than they could do just by simple tinkering, for instance. And years later, when Kelly ran the research department, Davison served as a kind of model for this person, that it was very important, Kelly, to have these people who could impart new knowledge and deeper knowledge. So that was one aspect of Kelly's influence, but there were many others. And he was very good at and felt it was very important to not only create these sort of leaders or exemplars who would help their colleagues, but also to create the environment architecturally. For instance, the main building at Bell Labs in Murray Hill, Kelly had a deep influence over how it was laid out. And he believed that people of all different disciplines should work together in very close proximity. He thought phone calls alone weren't enough, which is ironic because they worked for the phone company, but he thought you had to exchange ideas in person. And he also thought that, which might sound obvious now, but at the time was somewhat radical, that putting people in contact, not just like-minded people, not just, say, physicists clumped together, but the interface of different disciplines, that chemists and physicists and engineers all together, that new ideas came out of a kind of tension of an exchange between those groups, and also between, say, researchers and developers, between people thinking longer term or deeper and people thinking more practically. So he was ahead of his time in so many ways, and he was obviously a brilliant and far-thinking manager. And his influence really carried over from the labs from the 1930s, really until it was broken up by the phone company in the early 1980s. Broken up by the federal government, in the early 1980s.
He said so many interesting things that you quoted in your book. He says, A new device or invention stimulates and frequently demands other new devices and inventions for its proper use. Or another way to put it is innovation created other problems that needed solutions. So he really got it. The minute you solve something or invent something, you need to invent a few other things to allow for that thing to come in.
Yeah, he did. I was repeatedly, I mean, not just with Mervyn Kelly, but there are other people in the book who form the core story that I'm telling, and not just with Mervyn Kelly,
Sure.
but others. We sort of think of ourselves as very smart and accomplished and very farsighted today, but it's quite surprising to go back in time and to see how far-thinking and how deep these people thought, and it's really quite, makes quite an impression to think, way back then they had insights that we tend to think are new, but
Yeah.
really weren't.
I thought it was also really impressive when you really think about what it took to create Bell Labs and how many problems needed to get solved that were solved. The Navy called upon them for radar, how they dealt with competition and teams and patents and the atmosphere, and this thing about solving problems versus merely selling inventions I thought was interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, and that dates back really to those early days of the phone company, even maybe before Bell Labs. I mean, they had to invent everything like ringers and dial tones and busy signals, and then later on, as things kept growing, they were running this communication system that was ever expanding. So there were always problems that they were going to solve. And as you mentioned before, the solution to one problem was not the end of things. Sometimes it was just the beginning of things. And with some of the innovations I talk about in the book, for instance, the transistor, the transistor, for instance, was a solution to the problem of the vacuum tube, which was this wonderful electronic device that allowed for the amplification of phone signals and allowed for really cross-country communication. But the transistor itself created a number of problems. Even after its invention, it was very hard to develop and to manufacture, and then to manufacture in great quantities, and then it was very expensive. And so, these kinds of things, and then how do you create devices that you could use the transistor appropriately? And it really is fascinating that this whole, I guess you could say, ecosystem had to evolve in turn with every new dramatic invention that came out of Bell Labs.
What did you think about Dr. Claude Shannon?
I mean, Shannon's another of the main characters in my book, which
I wanted you to talk about him a little bit.
Yeah, the book focuses on really 5 or 6 people. Mervyn Kelly was one of the older of the group, but Claude Shannon was a mathematician. Claude Shannon grew up in Michigan and made his way for a PhD at MIT in really mathematics and engineering. And Shannon was, I guess, different people at Bell Labs had not only certainly different personalities and different kinds of expertise, but almost different, different ways of creating something original and groundbreaking. And Shannon was unusual in some ways in that he was very much a loner. He pursued things by himself. And Bell Labs was a very collaborative place. And not only that, but the mathematics department where Shannon worked was extremely collaborative. In fact, your bosses there wanted you to collaborate. You were encouraged to write papers together rather than by yourself. But Shannon was a lone thinker. He was not unfriendly, and in fact, he was humble. He was a kindly person, but he worked alone. And in the 30s, when Shannon was at MIT, he wrote what became known as the most influential master's thesis in history, where he sort of said that there's this way of planning computer logic where we can think of it in terms of ones and zeros, what was called Boolean algebra, to design computer circuits. By the time he got to Bell Labs in the 40s, he began working on cryptography and made some incredible contributions there. But really the great achievement of his life and his life at Bell Labs was something that came out in 1948. And it was called information theory. Originally it was called the theory of communications, but eventually became information theory. And it was really this long mathematical treatise on digital communications, on how all information could follow these same unifying principles, could be thought about digitally, ones and zeros, for instance. And it also explained how you could send any kind of message with perfection from place to place. And the question, I guess, is, okay, why does that matter? Well, he sort of gave a framework for sending messages that still is valuable and crucial today. And he also explained something which we've come to be known as error-correcting codes, of how you could send a message with really perfection by including other kinds of information with it. And it has allowed for instance, when you scratch a CD or DVD, why it still works fine, or how you can send deep space communications, or why communications can not be so susceptible to noise or interference. And it goes back to the work Shannon did way back when at Bell Labs. So he was really just an absolute genius in the real sense of the word.
So many exciting things got created there, invented there. But I want to talk a little bit about the first transatlantic phone cable system. Oh my God. I mean, the work on that and what it took to bring it to fruition. Talk about it. They invented the TAT-1, and they had a deal with the British Post Office to do it for undersea communications. Talk about it.
I'm really glad I'm glad you asked me about that. It's funny because nobody has asked me about that in all this time in the book, and it was dramatic. The Bell Labs had been working on undersea cables for years. It's hard to create a cable that sends phone signals underwater. One reason, especially underwater for vast distances, and in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, they began to send telegraph messages through undersea cables from the United States to Europe and to connect the continents. But sending a phone message is much more complicated than sending a telegraph dot-dash sort of signal. And the signal kind of dies out after tens of miles, certainly after hundreds of miles. So you need really these vacuum tubes or repeater bulbs that would amplify the signal every 50 or 70 miles in this phone cable. Well, how do you do that underwater for 2,000 miles? And for years, they had been planning this at Bell Labs, going back to the 1930s, but it hadn't been actually gotten a green light until the 1950s, under, again, Mervyn Kelly and a Bell Labs president named Oliver Buckley. And one of the most interesting things about the cable was it did have these vacuum tubes every 50 or 70 miles. I'm forgetting precisely how often the signal was repeated, but it was an enormous undertaking done in conjunction with the British Post Office. And instead of using transistors, which were a replacement for the vacuum tube, Kelly insisted that they only use technology that they knew could be depended upon to function for 20 years.
I thought that was so smart. What an intention. Isn't that neat?
You had to make the economics of the cable had to make sense. That once this cable was down there 2 miles deep, for instance, and it broke or it stopped working, and a transistor was a very new, possibly unreliable technology, what would you do? Well, God, it would be a nightmare. You'd have to have special ships, come down, and they did have these that would kind of claw up the cable and pull it up. You'd fix it, and you'd look.
What a job!
So what they did is they created this great innovation, the transatlantic cable, using in some ways the least innovative, or at least the least contemporary components. And there were actually two cables that were laid down at the same time. One would take calls to Europe, and one would go on the return cycle back. And they were opened in 1956. and they really, they could only in the beginning handle 30 or 40 conversations at a time, but they were a vast improvement over what existed up until that time, which would be where you would broadcast a connection from the United States to Europe by phone using radio signals, and that could be very unreliable based on atmospheric interference. So what you had with the transatlantic cable was a very reliable telephone connection that obviously was much richer in the way you could talk as opposed to telegraph signals, which was the case before then.
I try to look for themes when I read. One of the other interesting things was that telephone technology had been considered having a lot in common with new weapon systems, which allowed for these remote radar installations, work with the Navy, work with NSA, work with the Atomic Energy Commission, and work with Sandia. Would you like to talk about any of this part?
Yeah, the military component of Bell Labs was very significant. It was about 20% of their work after World War II, and it was deemed vital, as the leaders of Bell Labs saw it in that day and age. Vital for different reasons. Vital in that the country, as they saw it, needed their expertise. I think at the time that it's important, as I say in the book, to note that the information age was becoming pretty much intertwined with the atomic age. That the kind of communications technologies that were coming out of Bell Labs were essential in guiding missiles, for instance, or in detecting attacks. And Kelly believed it was crucial to work with the military. There was also another motive, that Bell Labs and the phone company was always worried about its monopoly status. And they felt that, to some extent, they lived in jeopardy of that monopoly being taken away. And as the executives of Bell Labs saw it, that by becoming indispensable to the business of government, military, it was not a cynical sort of endeavor, but they saw it as a sort of sensible and political endeavor, that becoming involved with Sandia Labs, for instance, or becoming involved with the distant early warning system, for instance, and lending their expertise to that, they were not only doing the country service, they were also in turn helping, to some extent, cement Bell Labs' importance and the Bell Systems integrated monopolies' importance to the United States government as well.
Yeah, it sounds like they had a profound contribution to many of these agencies and their ability to evolve and to function. I wanted to talk about the solar cell, because what was interesting about this, aside from what it is that it was said to have developed out of a culture of cooperation. On page 171 of your book, it says, what was striking but almost always overlooked about its invention was that 3 inventors of the device were working in different buildings. The solar cell just sort of happened. It was not team research in the traditional sense, but it was made possible because the lab's policy did not require us to get permission of our bosses to cooperate. At the laboratories, one could go directly to the person who could help. I think it's interesting that you tie that together, because I think that's important for people that are about innovating and as an outgrowth of cooperation. I just wondered if you wanted to talk more about it.
Yeah, I think that that there were different kinds of ways to innovate at Bell Labs. I've been asked, what was their formula, and I don't know if it was a formula as much as it was a structure. That sometimes innovations like the transistor came out of mid-sized teams that were put together by, in that case, Mervyn Kelly, that were put together with a particular goal in mind. But sometimes it was more like the silicon solar cell, which you just described, which just almost was serendipitous, that it depended on these human connections between the people there, that there were sort of this web of friendships between one of the guys, Gerald Pearson, who was a physicist, and somebody he knew from college, who was trying to solve, Daryl Chapin, who was trying to solve a particular problem. and it arose out of that. And again, as you mentioned, as I mentioned in the book too, that they didn't need permission; they could just kind of do it. So, the similarities I think are that these were people confronted with smart people working in close proximity, confronted with the right problem at the right time, but that there are different ways to make something revolutionary.
That piece that I read, I quoted from your book. I read up through part 1, which is almost 200 pages, and then there's a whole part 2. But
Right.
At this point, what was your take on how deep the competitiveness was? In part 1, it's obvious that there were players that were very competitive. They still cooperated. They still worked on things separately and together, but there was competition.
Yeah, I mean, especially in the transistor group, this group of scientists.
Big time.
Yeah, there was, and William Shockley, who was in charge of the transistor group, was a co-leader of the group, was very competitive, and two people under Shockley, John Bardeen and Walter Brattain, were the actual first inventors of what would be the first transistor. And Shockley had a very strong reaction to that. He was happy at first, but he was quite envious, and his competitive nature came out. This was problematic at Bell Labs because you weren't supposed to compete with people who worked under you. If you were a leader, you shared credit, you gave them ideas, you managed with a very light hand, but not in this case. That was not the case. And Bardeen and Bratton's invention of what was called the point contact transistor led Shockley over the next few months to create an even better transistor that was called the junction transistor. Now, you could say that that's just a natural reaction to kind of, it's a matter of human nature, and I think that's a fair statement. But
Absolutely.
At the same time, his the way he went about it created a sort of created a wonderful new technology, but it also created this rift at Bell Labs. And this very cohesive group, this transistor group that had been working diligently on these revolutionary ideas, really fell apart soon after that. So I think Shockley's a fascinating person, and again in the book there's a lot on personalities, because it's not just technologies and knowledge that make innovation happen. It's people, really, a lot of times, and it's this interplay between different kinds of people. And Shockley was a deeply complicated person, and he had a very strong influence, and people had very strong reaction to him too. And after that happened, it became pretty clear to the managers at Bell Labs that as brilliant as Shockley was, he was not a good manager of people. And in many ways after that, his ascent up the ranks at Bell Labs sort of stopped, and he became frustrated. And his frustration eventually led him to leave Bell Labs in the mid-1950s and to go to California. And this is another chapter in the Shockley story, because Shockley was really the first guy to bring the silicon to Silicon Valley. He started the first transistor company in Palo Alto, and he hired a bunch of brilliant people there too. And eventually his management shortcomings came out again, and the people who were working for him stormed off and formed another company. And the guys who he originally hired eventually went on to form the Intel Corporation. So he was great at picking talent, great at identifying brilliant people, great himself too with science and physics, but obviously very, very deficient in managing and handling people.
Well, maybe he just should have had a business card that said casting. He could have made big money in the entertainment industry then, because it's timing and script, but it's also about casting, isn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely. He was, and he was brilliant at that. He actually went so far as to test people who were interested in possibly working for him and taking psychological tests, and became deeply interested in how intelligence links to creativity, This eventually led him to yet another chapter in his life, a much darker one, where he became very interested in how race and intelligence are related, and really led him down this path towards eugenics, and really, in some ways, shockingly died in disgrace. And the book goes into that as well. But really, for about 10 years, from the mid 40s to the mid 50s or late 50s, he was really one of the world's most accomplished and revered scientists.
Interesting. It's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you know what I mean. I thought it was also interesting that innovation kind of was a term that came out of England.
Yeah, it dates in trying to understand how to explain or talk about innovation at Bell Labs. I did find myself feeling very strongly that I had to define it in a very clear way. I mean, we use the word pretty casually now, I think.
Right.
And we sort of use it, which is okay. I don't mean to make a value judgment on that, but I think in some ways it's hard to write about something that's so vague. But it turns out at Bell Labs they had a very specific definition of innovation. That it was not an invention, it was not a breakthrough. It was something that was carried through from a breakthrough stage, development stage. It was to a manufacturing stage. It was this whole process of bringing a new idea to the market, and it took many different people to do it in many different kinds of skills. And if you go back actually in time to reading a lot of the literature, scientific literature, engineering literature in the mid 20th century, the word innovation really isn't used that much in technology circles until the 1950s. I think Bell Labs I didn't start to see it until 1958 in the documents I was digging through. If you go back even farther to where this word came from, it dates back to 16th century to England, and it always sort of described similar things. It described a new idea, usually relating to philosophy or religion. But again, it took many centuries really to where it became much more focused on describing technology, and even in the 60s it was used sparingly, and I think it's a much more modern sort of term that we use.
I thought it was interesting that you wrote, almost by definition, a single person or even a single group could not alone create an innovation. The task was too variegated and involved. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, and again, that probably that really relates back to that sort of definition of how they thought of innovation. There was a guy who I talk about in my book named Jack Morton, who worked on the development of the transistor and was a very deep thinker about what innovation was at a time when really a lot of people weren't thinking about this kind of stuff, and was really sort of struggling to understand, what it meant. Again, we think we're really smart now, but these guys really were ahead of their time in so many ways.
Talk a little bit, if you would, about the distinction that's made between solving problems versus merely selling inventions.
I think that innovators, whatever kind of innovation they're working on, whether it's in Silicon Valley working on computer software, or back at Bell Labs where they were, creating transistors and lasers, I think in many ways they all think they're solving problems, and I think they are. It depends maybe what kind of problem you're solving, and I think that if we just look at cell phones, for instance, I think in Silicon Valley they use the word iterate a lot right now, which means a kind of newer version of a sort of
an iteration of something.
An iteration, right?
Okay, like iPhone 5.
Yes, right. Well, the iPhone 5 might be a big jump when it comes out.
All right, excuse me to the iPhone 5, but you know what I mean.
Yes, right. So the 4 and the 4S, So
there you go.
The 4S, so they iterated again. They created a sort of incremental innovation, I guess you could say. That are they selling invention? I think at Bell Labs they weren't selling stuff, in in that regard, that this was a place where you couldn't go to the store and buy Bell Labs technology. It was stuff. It was innovations that were inside of other electronic devices. So the market was not consumers. It wasn't like we think of today, where Apple has a new iPhone, for instance, or a new iPad out. It was a very different kind of model. But I don't denigrate in any way what the Silicon Valley companies are doing. And I'm sitting here in front of a wonderful MacBook Pro and a great BlackBerry right here too. So it's innovation too. It's different. It's valuable. One question I think I wrestle with, and I think is worth maybe a larger dialogue, is whether we're investing in the kind of research, basic research, scientific research that creates sort of breakthroughs, and maybe not just these more incremental sort of changes. And because I think the kinds of stuff that Bell Labs was investing in really yielded these huge jumps that created platforms for new industries and millions of jobs. And that's still happening. Universities do wonderful things in research, and our federal government invests in research and energy research and the like. But the question of are we doing enough? Are we doing it the right way? Is a very complex question. But it's something that maybe deserves a bit more consideration than we give it.
You are an editor for Fast Company. Would you like to talk a little bit about what you do there? What does an editor of Fast Company do?
Fast Company is a business magazine. We're out of New York City. We have a circulation of about 750,000. So we're all over the country. I edit features there. So I work with writers writing stories about, oftentimes business or technology. I also write myself. In fact, in the new issue, which is on the newsstand now, it has Mark Zuckerberg on the cover of Facebook.
I saw it.
Yeah, I wrote a long article on Tesla Motors, which is an electric car company out of Palo Alto, and it's a really fascinating company. Actually, a company that's doing something incredibly risky and trying to change the model, to sort of compete with Detroit by creating this breakthrough electric car.
Very exciting.
A lot of people know that Tesla Roadster, but they're coming out with this new family car, I guess, a very high-end family car, a Model S they call it. But it's a fascinating company. So I spent a few weeks out there and wrote about in a long feature for Fast Company that should be out right now.
What a great magazine. And your work at the New York Times, talk a little bit about that, the New York Times Magazine.
Yeah, from about 2004 on, I have been a feature writer for the New York Times Magazine. I don't have time so much to write for the magazine now as an editor at Fast Company, but I do write for the magazine. I do write for the New York Times whenever I can. I wrote a long piece actually about Bell Labs for their Sunday Review section a few weeks back. It was called True Innovation, and it looked at some of the ideas that I developed much further in the book, and sometimes also I contribute to the New York Times Book Review on Sundays as well.
The Institute of Creative Technology that Kelly was talking about at Bell Labs, he says, always required a stable supply of money. Do you think that's still true today?
I think that's right, in the sense that you can, or at least from every technology or scientific researcher I talk to, there's this danger of a boom and bust cycle, that having money to do research and then not having it a year or two after can be problematic, and it makes it hard to think long-term, I think, or to plan long-term. You can't plan a scientific breakthrough. It would be great if you could, but these things don't happen on a schedule. So sometimes they require a long time frame. They require that steady or stable stream of dollars, which doesn't mean that at Bell Labs they would let people pursue dead ends for years and years on end. They looked for progress or insights or some kind of benchmarks and achievements, But at the same time, I think they understood that there was no schedule for genius, as they called it at the time.
Is there anything else that you would like to share with us today in closing the segment?
I think one thing that I may have touched on before, but that I've been trying to hopefully get across too, is that I think the book is about innovation, certainly, and it's about the specific innovations that came out of Bell Labs at this one sort of amazing place at this one point in time, but that it is a story of people, and that in focusing on this sort of remarkable small group of people that I discuss in the book, it tells a very hopefully engaging story of their lives and how innovation is a real human process and not just a technological process.
I really want to thank you for your many years of work on the Idea Factory, Bell Labs, and the Great Age of American Innovation. Jon Gertner, thank you so much for being with us. Everybody go out and buy the Idea Factory, Bell Labs, and the Great Age of American Innovation. And Jon, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you, Kim. It's great.